Have you ever wanted to love someone but couldn't? That's how I felt about Tammy. We never should have gotten together in the first place. But it was her birthday, and I didn't know what I was getting myself in for. She invited all 5 of us from the office, and I was expecting to just have a drink and go home. Fast forward to the bar, half an hour passed when we were all supposed to meet, and every time her phone buzzed, I knew it was another person canceling at the last minute. But she was glowing with warmth that wasn't dampened by her disappointment, and I had nowhere else to be. And hours can melt together so fast when you found someone to be lonely with. Tammy blamed herself for how the party turned out in a vicious, self-deprecating way that left me scampering to reassure her. And the harder she was on herself, the kinder I had to be, until somehow, without meaning to, I called her beautiful, because I couldn't bear her thinking otherwise for another minute. The way her face lit up in response was proof that I wasn't lying, and the way she smiled back made me feel like it was the first time she'd ever really believed those words. Tammy stayed close to me as we were living together, close enough to feel her breath on my neck. Then her arms were wrapped around my arm, and her warmth wasn't just something to be imagined anymore. Just to keep her balance, she said, but no amount of steadying herself was enough for her to let go. She'd been drinking after all, and needed someone to drive her home. Well, I think she really was beautiful that night, and the more of her she trusted me to see, the more beautiful she became. But love? It wasn't her fault that she came to love me, and it wasn't my fault that I couldn't feel the same. A starving man doesn't care what he eats, though, and the lonely will cling to anyone who makes them forget what it's like to be alone. Tammy and I stayed together, and the phrase, "maybe this is what love is supposed to feel like," kept hopping up in my head. Tammy treated me with devotion and smothered me in kindness, and the longer we stayed together, the harder it became to imagine my life being any other way. Tammy would do anything to keep me, and she reminded me every day. I could think of no better way to thank her than with everything I had to give. She was nothing but joy on the day I asked her to marry me, and basking in that light, I told myself that her happiness would be enough for the both of us for all my years ahead. Then there was my other wife, the one with the shaved head, the one with the nose rings, and the leather jacket, and the tattoo of a snake twisting from one thigh to the next. I don't know if you could call Zara beautiful, certainly not in the same way you could Tammy, but you could call her other names, and they'd all turn her on. I met Zara in another town where my company's headquarters was. I had to go once a month, every month, but it didn't take long before I found an excuse to go every weekend instead. Tammy was pregnant, and I wasn't proud about what I was doing. But neither was I ashamed, because any guilt I should have felt was a drop in the ocean that was love. Zara was everything I'd never known I'd wanted. She was wild, unrestrained, insatiable. She was a witch who put me under her spell, a demon who had claimed my soul. These are the types of excuses I'd tell myself whenever the guilt began to crawl up my spine. When I'd hold Tammy at night, I'd tell myself stories of all the mad things men have ever done for love. I'd put myself in their noble company. And when I fell asleep, I'd dream of being back with the girl whose touch was fire. A weekend was never enough to spend with Zara, and every time was harder to leave than the last. I couldn't leave Tammy with the child, though, and the anxious worry that this had to end began eating away at me night and day. I kept them both a secret from each other, swinging back and forth, barely trusting myself to call one by name without my tongue betraying me with the others. The more the pressure grew, the more insecure and defensive I became, until one day, by surprise, Zara told me she was jealous of my time. She didn't want me to leave again. She wanted to be my wife, and fool that I was, I told her that I wanted the same. It wasn't a very official wedding. Zara wasn't into that sort of thing. Our hands were clasped in the forest, and our feet were in the stream when I placed a ring upon her finger. My life as I knew it had ended forever, and I couldn't imagine anything but happiness to come. I told myself then that I would make one last trip to end things with Tammy. She'd be better off alone, I wanted to believe, than with someone who didn't need her anymore. I would do my part and help pay for the child, and I wouldn't need much money because nothing I could buy would fill my heart the way holding Zara did. Tammy would cry, but I wouldn't break. In 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, when I'm old and gray with shaking hands, I'll hold Zara all the tighter, knowing that I was almost too weak to follow my heart. And maybe that's how it would have gone if Zara hadn't followed me back. She thought she would surprise me by making the trip to help me move. She thought she was being clever by calling my work and pretending to be a client setting up a meeting at my home. How could she have known that Tammy was home while I'd gone to the store to pick up some things for our newborn child? The police were home before I was. The weeping young mother and the screaming punk. It wasn't hard for them to figure out what happened. The knife-slashed curtains and the shattered plates. There must have been quite a fight to be loud enough for the neighbors to call the cops. The blood-stained carpet and the dirty tracks into the nursery. There was no way to hide the evidence or mistake what happened to my daughter, who was slashed into ribbons before she'd ever learned her name. Zara and I never spoke again, not even at her trial, where I was called as a witness. I couldn't even meet her eyes when I told the jury about the affair, that I loved her, and that I knew it was wrong. I told them that Zara had been jealous, that she'd killed the child, and that I never wanted to see her again. The only thing that could have been harder to bear was when Tammy forgave me. She said it wasn't my fault, that I'd made a mistake, that we could learn to be happy together again. And I believed her, because as heavy as this weight was for me to bear, I knew that I couldn't bear it alone. That was almost 20 years ago, and Tammy and I have moved past it the best we could. We had 2 more children, both boys. I'm glad of that, because if we'd had a girl, I don't think I could have looked at her without thinking about the child who had been cut. If Tammy can still love me after all that, then who am I to say that I can't love her in return? Despite everything I'd done to avoid being alone, though, I know that it's only a matter of time. Tammy is sick, and she isn't going to get better. I've been spending every day at my wife's side, and our youngest will be leaving to college in a few weeks. Then it's just going to be me and my regrets. Thinking about the words Tammy said to me last night. I told you I'd do anything to keep you, and I did, she told me. If you didn't think Zara killed our daughter, you never would have stayed with me. I had to do it. Don't you see? We've made each other so happy through the years. I always knew I never loved her, but it's taken me my entire life to find out why. It was a silly little mistake. I was trying to nail my husband's favorite selfie to the wall when the hammer slipped on the backstroke and I pierced his forehead with the claw. He was standing immediately behind me, micromanaging as usual. He collapsed on the apartment floor, the claw embedded deeply in his thick skull. Placing one foot on his cranium, I wiggled it out. This in turn produced copious bleeding, like a water bubbler gurgling above his left eye, all of which saturated the Persian rug he'd insisted we buy with my already overextended Capital One credit card. Determined to limit the damage to the apartment and my security deposit, I dragged him into the bathtub, where he, at last, bled out. Pitying him for once, I gave his pale body a sponge bath, cleaning him thoroughly in a way he seldom did himself. Weak with shock, I filled the bath with hot water until it covered us both to our chins. I, of course, held his up, gripped by the curious notion that if I let go, he'd slip under and drown. My mind raced. I remained rooted in place. I stared at my husband for hours that turned into days. His visage collapsed and his body stiffened. I lost my fear that he'd grabbed me by the throat as he often had when I'd done something bad. Then things got weird. I fell madly in love with the bastard again. Still and cold, he was the man I'd always desired but never had. He was always home, never asked for money, and never complained. The bathtub, with its squalid water and terrible stench, became our cozy little love nest. Frankly, it was the best time we'd had together since he'd lost the key to our honeymoon hotel room and hadn't been able to rape me again that night. No one, not even family, came to the apartment door. My husband's boasts and tirades had alienated everyone, including the Grubhub and DoorDash delivery guys. I subsisted on peanut butter, bread, and my newfound peace of mind. My husband, of course, required nothing but a daily oiling to help preserve his dry skin. Inspired, I started a journal, writing down why my life was better with my husband dead. A few highlights. 1. The last time he'd passed stinky beer gas was when he collapsed after I killed him. 2. No more of him asking for a more at 4 a.m. when I just started my period. 3. His cadaver keeps me cool on hot nights, now that the utility company turned the power off. 4. No more monopolizing the remote, once I pried it from his cold dead hands. 5. Finally, the strong, silent type. 6. I talk, he listens, or at least appears to when I adjust his face a certain way. 7. When we make love now, I'm on top. Yes, romance blossomed in our secret hideaway. It was like putting a do not disturb sign on our entire relationship. But, as the philosophers say, all good things come to an end. I'm delinquent on rent, the lights have been turned off, and the water has stopped running too. I'm afraid that our second honeymoon is over. The police will be coming soon. I can almost smell it. And my neighbors have probably started smelling my husband too. Perhaps, just perhaps, before I'm jailed, the cops will let us renew our vows at a funeral home or crematorium. I can just see his urn now, atop the wedding cake. Hopefully things will work out better between us next time. But that's the beauty of loving a corpse. If you get tired of one, you can always disinter another. Open up. Cops at the door threatening to kick it in. Just a moment. I'm not dressed. I dragged my husband into our bedroom. It wasn't hard. He must have lost 100 pounds. You have 3 minutes, lady. Then we're breaking it down. The building manager asked us to perform a welfare check. The hallway stinks. Are you all right? Better than ever, I shouted, pulling on my old wedding gown. Thank goodness it still fit. Guess that was the silver lining to all the cottage cheese, tepid water, and toast I'd eaten at my husband's insistence. Almost done. There was a loud crash. Moving like lightning, I stuffed my husband into his tuxedo, pulled him to his feet, and worked his mouth into a beaming smile. The cops spilled into our marital bedroom, stopped and stared. They didn't speak. My mind whirling, weeks of isolation shattered. It seemed appropriate to ask, "Is the limo outside?" "The what?" the closest cop asked, finding his voice. From his badge, I could see he was a sergeant. "The limo. To drive us to the wedding? We're renewing our vows." A female officer, mature and wise, pushed her way to the fore. "Sure, honey. It's downstairs waiting. We're the police escort. We'll be clearing the route." She turned to the sergeant, softly tapping her finger against her temple. He nodded. This irritated me. "Oh, so you think I'm crazy?" "Darling, What woman isn't on her wedding day? She offered her arm. Come on, let's walk downstairs. The sergeant here will help your husband down. He looks a little peaked. Well, that's a man for you. Strong as steel except when it comes to walking down the aisle. Slowly with great majesty I descended the stairs. The street was empty, but for multiple cruisers and flashing lights. The police escort? You can call it that, the policewoman answered. She was so kind. A long black Cadillac pulled up. 2 grim men exited and removed my husband from the sergeant's arms. Are you the limo drivers? I asked. One of them, an older man wearing blue plastic gloves, eyed me quizzically. Lady, we're from the mortuary. The policewoman intervened before I had time to react. Your husband will be riding with them. You're up here, she said, guiding me towards a gray 4-door sedan. I began to squirm. For the first time since I killed my husband, something seemed off. You mean we're riding separately? Never heard of that. It's the latest trend Bride magazine says, the policewoman replied. She tightened her grip. I slapped her face. The 2 cops and the driver of the gray sedan wrestled me into the back seat. They strapped me in with a seatbelt and wide leather straps. A gauzy hood came down over my head. I bit it with my teeth. A torn label flopped over. It read, Property State Hospital. We're not going to a chapel. You're committing me. You'll have your own private room, the policewoman said. Her lip was bleeding, and her cheek was red. It's called the honeymoon suite. After you, the driver cracked. He put the sedan in gear. Why? It's the same locked room you occupied after you hammered your first husband to death 10 years ago, the policewoman said. She adjusted the hood so it was easier for me to breathe. With a ball peen, that time. It all came back now. The secret I had tucked away, after they'd freed me on conditional release. My pervert dad, my volcanic anger, my bad taste for very bad men. I screamed, and kept screaming every moment of every day for years and years, to ensure that my voice, and the voice of all mistreated women, was finally, truly heard. I met her while I was weeding the flower garden. I had just about finished up when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. They may have been trying to get my attention for a while. I had my headphones in, and the only reason I heard anything was because I was in between songs. Sorry. I pulled out an earbud and scrambled to my feet. I didn't hear you back there. My voice got choked up in my throat as I stared into the soft, dark eyes of the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Her golden hair came down in waves past her shoulders, and she had a smile like sunshine. She quietly laughed. I wasn't waiting long. You seem to be enjoying your music anyway. She offered me her hand. My name is Bea. Her name could have been Mud, and I would have thought it was the prettiest name in the world. I'm Cassie, but everyone just calls me Cass. I shook her hand, inwardly kicking myself as I saw I got dirt all over my hand. Crap, I'm sorry. Bea laughed again, just brushing her hand off on her skirt. A little dirt won't kill me. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the Lakeview Cemetery. Oh, you're not far. I pointed down the street. Just down the ways. Take a right at Petunia Road. It'll be on the left. If you hit Black Street, you've gone too far, and you'll need to turn around. Bea turned to look, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. I see. You visit often? She asked. I nodded. It's where my parents are buried. I try to go every other week. If you need to pick up flowers, Mary's garden is right nearby. Tell her you're there to pick something up for a deceased relative or friend, and she'll give you a good deal. It's you. I nearly tripped over my feet to look up at the door. My grandfather was leaning against the doorframe with an expression like he had seen a ghost. "Grandpa, what are you doing out of bed?" I rushed to his side, all thoughts about the pretty girl in my front yard gone. "You need to be resting." Resting wouldn't change his rapidly approaching fate, but it would make him more comfortable when the time came. He pointed a shaky finger at Bea. It's you. I know it's you. How? Where's Francis? Is he still with you?" he asked. The woman blinked owlishly before her eyes widened in recognition. "Robert! The years have changed with you. I am terribly sorry for not realizing you were still living here." She looked at me before curtsying. "I'll come talk to you again. I have to be going." "Bye," I said, waving as I watched Bea return to her car. She opened the door and held it open just for a second to let a young man poke his head out. He wasn't nearly as graceful as Bea when he seemingly recognized my grandfather, his jaw dropping and eyes nearly popping out of his head. He dived back into the car before Bea slipped in and it drove off. I looked at my grandfather, who looked like he'd experienced a shock. "Do I need to call Dr. Samuel?" "I just need to be alone for a bit." My grandfather shuffled back to his bedroom, leaving me alone. It wasn't until the sun was going down that he called me into his bedroom. My grandfather was a quiet man. I'd never known him to make the outbursts like the one earlier that day. Even when I entered the room, he just pointed to his closet. "Check behind the coats. There's a photo frame," he said. I moved aside old coats and a far outdated tuxedo to find the photo frame. I brought it out and sat beside my grandfather's bed to get a better look. The picture inside was faded and black and white, but I could recognize a much younger version of my grandfather sitting out on the front porch, his arm wrapped around a black teenager about his age. "I've never seen this picture before," I said, tilting it side to side. When Grandma had been alive, she'd shown me her albums again and again, even as the cancer wasted her away. "I just keep it for myself. His name is Francis." I nodded while reaching for my cell phone. "Listen, Grandpa, you're a little tired. How about I call—" "Listen to me, Cassandra." My grandfather snapped, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin. "You bring up calling the damn doctor again, and I'm sending you to your room." Even with me being 21, that was a very real threat. I sunk down in my chair, deciding not to question him anymore. "Who is Francis, Grandpa?" I asked. He calmed down and looked back at the photo. I saw a touch of a smile on his lips. "Francis was my best friend. See, his father saved mine. After that, my father referred to him as a brother. White and colored was never an issue. Our families were close. I was just a few days younger than Francis. We could never attend the same schools or play together in the park. But if I wasn't at his home, he was at mine. If he couldn't sleep, he would sneak in through my bedroom window and we'd stay up just talking about anything and everything under the sun. I had his back. He had mine. We were just as close as our fathers." The story was heartwarming, but there was certainly a part nagging at me. "Why have you never talked about Francis before then?" I asked. That smile on my grandfather's face vanished. "Because I never wanted to think of him again." He handed me the frame to hold as he told me the story. "It was probably a week after this photo was taken that we met her. We were on a walk through the woods. We took a lot of those, just so we couldn't be bothered by people who thought a black man and a white man couldn't be friends. We were on the way back when we heard a car refusing to turn over. Francis insisted we take the right path to see if someone needed help. I followed, as he was always the leader out of the two of us. We didn't expect to see such a nice car way back where we were. But what we didn't really expect to see was the behemoth of a man poking away at the engine, or the girl standing beside the car, her dress spattered in mud as she shivered in the cold. She looked up at us, and her eyes met Francis's, and I knew it was all over then, because he looked at her, and he fell in love. Was she also black? I asked. She was Bea. You mean she looked like Bea? I asked. He shook his head. No, I mean that the Bea you talked to today was the same Bea standing on the road next to the car that wouldn't start. He scowled as he saw me open my mouth. I'm not crazy. You know I still have all my marbles. You should shut it and listen. I closed my mouth. Good girl. Now where was I? My grandfather's eyes went glassy as he was transported to a much different time. Right. Francis was just about frozen in place, so I had to shout out and ask if they were all right. Turns out they'd stopped for a picnic, and when they got back, damn thing wouldn't start. That's when Francis's brain started working again and he offered his help. He was pretty handy with cars. I just sat with the giant as Francis got to work and started chatting with Bea. I found out his name was Sten, but we didn't really talk much. We just watched Bea and Francis interact, and let me tell you, you could tell the attraction was mutual by the way she laughed and how she'd brush her fingers against his arm. I think Francis was disappointed when the car finally got running, but I'll admit, I was relieved. I didn't know what she had going through her head, flirting with Francis like that. I thought the color of Francis's skin didn't matter, I said. My grandfather shook his head. Cass, you have to remember where we live. About 3 years before, a black man was accused of groping a white woman. No evidence, it was just what her brother said what happened. What happened to that poor bastard? My grandfather shuddered. It wasn't human. Humans don't do that to other humans. I was worried about Francis's safety. I gave him an earful on the way home about it. He was a bit embarrassed, but he realized where I was coming from. I was worried for him. He promised me he'd be more careful, and that was that. Or so I thought. My grandfather took back the picture frame and removed the back. He took out a photo hidden behind the other one and placed it on his lap. This one was slightly better quality. I now knew what my grandfather meant by behemoth. The one standing next to Francis was an absolute giant. Next to them stood two women, one crossing her arms and trying to look serious, while a woman of Asian descent was practically leaning all of her weight on the serious woman, clearly laughing and having a good time. Sten, Francis, Alana, and Liwa. My grandfather pointed at each of them when he said their name. So many things you can't see in this picture. Alana's hair was so red you'd think it'd somehow find a way of bleeding into these old pictures. Liwa had the most joyful laugh. When she got going, the whole town could hear it. I never saw her without a smile. Sten's arms were covered in this old scars. I never got the story for all of them, but he was a warrior, a soldier in another life, he told me. I leaned in close to the picture. Who are these people? I asked. They were bees. Looking back in the bed, my grandfather sighed. Almost 2 weeks after we found her stranded on the side of the road, I would have forgotten all about it. But when we were heading home after work, we were suddenly surrounded by Bee's two girlfriends. Liwa looped her arm in with Francis's. Alana put hers with mine, and they pulled us down the street towards a car, as they chatted us up like we were old friends. I'd thought I was about to get robbed when I recognized who was driving the car. It was Sten. Alana and Liwa drew straws to see who would be walking. There wasn't enough spots for all of us to sit. Liwa lost and proceeded to call Alana a bitch before laughing and starting to walk. Sten drove us to probably one of the nicest houses in town, and that's when we had tea with Bea. My grandfather rolled his eyes. She said she's always had a taste for the dramatic, Any advice I gave Francis he probably forgot, and the two flirted the whole damn time. I mean, by then I realized she wasn't just trying to get Francis in trouble. She'd had him brought to her just so they could be on a date. But I still didn't trust her. She was strange. Something about her just didn't sit right with me. He paused for a while. But when she came to me asking for my help to find ways to keep seeing Francis, I couldn't say no. She said she'd found him handsome, charming, and genuine. She called the time we lived in full of sociopaths that would stone Francis if they had any idea they were interested in each other romantically. She promised me she wouldn't hurt him. Promised me that if anyone tried to hurt him, they'd have to go through her first. I told her to get in line because they'd be going through me first. That smile on her face almost seemed a little condescending, but she said that Francis couldn't ask for a better friend. They started seeing each other weekly. I was their go-between. I'd pass letters in between the two of them, tell them when the other had time to meet. I took that picture right there. He pointed to the one with Bea's friends. And I watched their romance blossom. I learned more about the world from Bea and the others than I ever learned from school. I considered them friends. But the perfect little secret that Francis and Bea had couldn't stay secret forever. My grandfather's shoulders sagged as he placed the photograph on his bedside table. It was just a whisper. I think someone noticed the look in Francis's eyes whenever Bea passed by, or maybe they weren't nearly as discreet as they thought. But when the whispers started, I knew my friend was in danger. People had killed for less than whispers. We made a plan. Dead of night, they'd pack up, head north. I'd accompany them to New York and see them off to France. Hell, I even considered going with them. Go see the world. We never got a chance. I shook my head. I'm not going to like this story's end, am I? I asked. My grandfather didn't answer. Instead, he continued with his stories. Francis and I were heading to Bea's house. Our suitcases were packed. Francis was humming love songs under his breath when I heard the gunshot. Grandfather's fists balled up, knuckles turning white. I saw blood shoot out from Francis's side and he fell to the ground. I turned and saw the sheriff leading a mob of angry men. I could have left Francis then, saved myself from the heap of trouble I was going to be in, but I didn't. I picked Francis up and carried him the rest of the way. My grandfather reached up and pulled down his shirt sleeve, revealing an old puckered scar. They got me once in the shoulder, twice in the leg. I remember you being a little girl and asked why I walk the way you do. I did say I'd tell you when you were older. Well, now you know. I don't know how I made it to Bea's house, but I collapsed at the front door. Francis was cussing. I was too. The door opened and out walked Bea. When she saw how bloodied up we both were and how Francis was hurt bad, I saw a tear sneak down her face before she just went dead calm and wiped it away. For a few moments, he was quiet. Cass, you know I've not lost my mind. I'm sharp as I was back then, maybe even more so. But what I saw, I just wanted to forget all these years, and I never can. Bea walked out in front of the mob, followed by the others. She looked at the mob and quietly asked who shot Francis. One of the stupid bastards near the front raised his hand, and then she snapped it off with the same amount of effort it would take to break a twig. He howled before she went for his throat. Her canines became sharp as knives, and she'd grown claws an inch long. The others followed suit. Alana ripped open the sheriff's ribcage and stomped on his heart. Sten took a man's head and crushed it between his hands. The man's brain splattered over his face before he roared like a lion and charged into the fray. Lewa caught a coward trying to run away before dragging him into the dark.
I heard him scream once for his mother before I heard a crack and nothing else.
Grandfather shook his head.
It was over quicker than you'd think. That mob was about 20 men in their prime, and in about 5 minutes each one was dead. Sten licked off each of his fingers before coming to me, picking me up and carrying me indoors while Bree cradled Francis in her arms. I wasn't sure if he was breathing anymore, and that was the last time I saw him.
What happened after that? I asked, shocked I could find my voice.
They disappeared.
My grandfather shrugged.
When I woke up the next morning, I was in my own bed, all bandaged up. The whole town was in an uproar. The sheriff and his sons all dead, along with several other upstanding men of the town. Bea was gone, along with the others. No sign of where they'd gone. Francis was also gone. They never found his body, but they went and said he was dead anyhow. Probably for the best. I can't imagine how they'd blame the slaughter on a single man, but I'm surprised they didn't try. We all just pretended nothing ever happened. I took care of Francis's little siblings like they were my own brothers and sisters. I never told anyone before tonight about my best friend.
I couldn't believe it. Most of me wanted to reason out how that could have happened. Stuff like that didn't happen. Instead, when I opened my mouth, I asked, "Was the man in the car today? Was it really Francis?"
Looking just like the last day I saw him.
My grandfather sunk into the pillow. I could see how tiring this whole experience was for him.
Whatever Bea was, must have crawled right up out of hell. You need to know that before you go with her.
What do you mean? I asked. My grandfather smiled sadly.
Because the way your eyes lit up while looking at her, it was the same way Francis's did when he first saw her. I think I'm going to shut my eyes for now. I'm feeling tired. Go to bed, Cassandra. I love you.
I swallowed the hard lump in my throat before getting up. I love you too, Grandpa, I said before fleeing the room. Just before I closed the door, I think I heard the sound of his window being pushed up, but I wasn't sure until I came in the next morning and it had been left open. My grandfather had passed away with the most content look on his face. He was at peace, finally having revealed his darkest secret. The funeral had long been planned. Nearly everyone in town attended. People came up to me and told me how my grandfather was the most open-minded and kindest person. I got told stories of his generosity, his good sense of humor. Hours passed until I was finally sitting alone between his grave and the ones of my parents. My tears had dried up, leaving an empty hole inside me. For the first time in my life, I could truly say I was alone. I heard quiet footsteps approach, and I looked up to see her. Bea was wearing a dark coat and black stockings. Her hair had been carefully pinned back, her eyes reddened with tears. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. I nodded and patted the ground next to me, the side closer to my grandfather's grave. She nodded before taking her seat, folding her legs under herself. "Your grandfather was my friend. I owe him a great deal. Did he tell you about me?" she said. I nodded. "Shot 3 times, carrying the bleeding body of my dearest love and his dearest friend." Bree's breath shuddered, and she wiped her eyes. "I could never repay that. I offered, but I knew he wouldn't accept the only thing I had to give before he even responded. I'm not sure if he even remembered the talk we had before I took him home that night." Her fingers combed through the freshly turned earth. "What did you offer?" I asked quietly. "Eternity." She got up and glanced at the other pair of graves next to me. "He's with his wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law.
I think he couldn't live in a world that he knew he'd never be able to see them again. So I am glad he didn't take my gift when I offered it again last night. She looked down at me and smiled, extending her hand. Would you like to go on a trip? A change of pace might help you. I knew what offer was hidden behind those words. I glanced at my parents' graves, dead when I was just a little girl. I looked at my grandparents' graves, much newer than theirs. I took Bea's hand and she pulled me to my feet. I think I wouldn't mind visiting Paris. I've always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower. Is it more beautiful in person? I asked. Bea smiled wildly. It will take your breath away. Together we walked to the car. This one was probably a lot bigger than the one my grandfather talked about. Sten was even bigger than the picture suggested. He was sitting in the driver's seat while Liwa took selfies of them both. I think I caught a glimpse of some sort of Instagram filter on the screen before Liwa dropped the phone. She was laughing too hard to hold it. In the back seat, Alana was reading something on a Kindle, absorbed entirely in the digital pages. The car door opened, and there sat Francis. His eyes were also tinged red from tears, but he smiled as he looked at me. You look a lot like your grandfather. Come on in. We got space to squeeze in one more.
Thank you for making it this far. I hope you enjoyed the video. I just wanted to quickly let you know about a couple things I have going on. I have an Instagram where I post more personal things about who I am. It isn't just all creepy stuff. You can find me at Stories After Midnight. I also have a Twitter where I mainly retweet and like things I find interesting. The handle for that is in the description, but it is S_A_midnight. I should really find another one because that's hard to say. If you really like what I'm doing, consider joining the Midnighters. That's my growing community where we hang out and have fun and talk about cats. You can find a link to our Discord in the description below. We'd love to see you there. Other than that, it'd make me happier than a cat on a table full of antique glassware if you'd like the video and consider sticking around for more. We'll see you in the next one.